Welcome to Punch Keys Podcast. I'm Poppy Minix, your co-host, bringing you blunt talk for the fiction novelist.
And I'm Cascade, your other writerly co-host. If you love to ramble about writing and need a tribe, you found us.
Are you ready? We're uncorking now. Let's talk about punching those keys.
We are here, and it is time.
Yay! Yeah, it is.
Punch Keys, here we come.
We are here with part 2.
Part 2, we are. First part was first chapters. So obviously the second part is second chapters, right?
No, God, we'd be here forever. Yes.
We're now on
okay. I guess I can totally do that.
Episode is the next chapter of your book, step by step. I think I would die of boredom, guys.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
No, we are doing last chapter today.
We are doing last chapters. Gosh. I have anxiety about last chapters. So much pressure. Yes.
Well, I think they're equally as important as first chapters, and it gets overlooked because there's so much pressure put into your first chapter, because if no one keeps reading, no one reads your book. So obviously the first chapter has to hook them. But if you don't land it right, then they're not going to read the next book. They're not going to read more of your stuff.
They're not going to feel good when they end your book, and you want them to feel good.
So you want them to feel satisfied.
Satisfied. Some people might want to, end your book bawling, and that's totally fine, but they need to at least be satisfied with that.
Which is kind of the first point, right? So understanding what the genre expectations are when you're trying to figure out your ending.
Definitely.
They're not the same. There's not like a universal, every book needs to end with cotton candy and pink skies. That's just not going to work.
Yeah.
The basic stuff I was looking at when I started looking at it was, obviously I looked up concluding horror, and you have to deal with the monster. How you deal with that monster, whether it raises more questions or if it reveals an even worse monster, whatever, as long as whatever that original monster was that's introduced in your story, even if it's like a psychological monster they're fighting or whatever it is, it has to be dealt with by the end. There has to be a conclusion to what happens with the demise of that monster. That's kind of the expectations there. Romance is happily ever after.
Absolutely.
Comedy is usually ending like with a party, with a wedding, with a celebration of some sort. Tragedies are generally ending with a funeral, a death, a loss of something. Saying goodbye to an area that you love and you don't want to, but you have to, losing something.
Yep. The impact of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I was kind of, the one genre that gets me whenever I'm looking up genre stuff is literary fiction. Mm-hmm. Because it's like, talk about loosey-goosey rules.
Oh, it's like whatever you feel like ending, it's the ending. Yeah.
So basically, I would definitely want to talk to throughout this about cathartic reading and how it has to be feel good at the end, but I catch myself saying good all the time, and I guess just satisfied. I mean, there has to be some way that the reader feels like it's like the story is ended. It's not like it just stopped mid-story and now we're done.
Right.
Have you run into that before?
Yes, I have. And I've probably raged to you about it a few times.
So what do you think happens? Like, what are signifiers that show that the book didn't complete itself?
There was 0 arcs concluded. It literally ended on a page where I'm like, wow, this is getting close to the end. Like, I don't know how they're going to finish any of this out. And then they'll be like in the middle of an argument and it'll be like the end. I'm like, what? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Did you seriously just do that? Are you kidding me? It was like they had a full book, but it was too long, so they decided to split it, except they didn't actually end the first one. They just stopped. And I'm like, no, banished. But that's me. Some people probably are fine with that. I am totally not. I am not a reader for cliffhangers like that. You need to conclude something. I'm fine for happy for nows. I'm fine for episodic, okay, we've ended it and then there's so much more. I've written books like that before. Like, I am cool with that. I am not cool with just ending. Doop-to-doo. Just didn't seem like it had a purpose.
I wonder sometimes too, because I've seen it and I wonder if it's Because you learn, like we talk all the time about read to learn pacing and to get a feel for it and understand it, especially for your genre. I almost wonder if it's people learning pacing from TV series. Because binging everything on Netflix and everything is a huge thing right now. And episodic writing, which is a thing even like online, not just writing for TV shows, but there's episodic writing where you release a chapter's worth, weekly, monthly, whatever. There's a whole new Vela that's probably out by the time this episode is released. It'll be out. Yeah, and it's basically episodic writing. And so that cliffhanger to go on makes sense because you're not concluding everything. And TV series do it, right? At the end of the big, like the season premiere, or season finale, sorry, there's like a cliffhanger. Things are not concluded usually. It like cuts halfway, and you have to wait till the next season to figure out what happens. I think people confuse a book to be like a season in a TV show.
I could definitely see that happening.
And I don't think it works the same.
I don't really like TV shows that do that either, unless they've concluded something. If you've taken me on a really awesome journey and I've learned about your world and I've learned at what's going on and I realize that there's a bigger problem that we didn't even know about until later on in the season, all right, okay, I'm cool with that. There's a big, giant antagonist that we're just meeting because we've learned about our people, we've learned about our world, and we've learned a little bit of something. And then you realize toward the end, it's like, oh, this is so much bigger than we thought it was. All right. Okay. I can deal with that. I really am okay with that. Even if it's a book. All right. But I still need some kind of satisfied, okay, we understand what we're working with now, and now we have to go kill it. Cool. Okay, now we have to go fix it. Now we have to go break it down and build it back up again. I need like some kind of emotional conclusion that, okay, now we're going to go. Now we're going to go do this. And that is a fine for a cliffhanger. I'm cool with that. I'm just not cool with it just randomly ending. It has to be purposeful.
Do you think part of that satisfaction comes if the character has had an arc? Like if the character's had an arc and if they emotionally have... So the example you're talking about, okay, we have to go, we know what it is now, we have to go fight it. Fighting it's going to be book 2. If their emotional arc was pretending that leprechauns aren't real and a leprechaun is stalking them and trying to kill them, if at the end they haven't killed the leprechaun, but they acknowledge that it's alive and they have to go fight it, your character has had an arc.
Exactly. Yeah. That is the form of arc conclusion. I'm good with that. That works for me. Cool. Okay. That satisfied me that the poor protagonist had such a fear and now they're like, okay, I'm going to face this fear directly. I'm good with that kind of cliffhanger. That is cool. I just don't like it when nothing has concluded and it's literally a split book. That makes me nuts. If you're going to do a cliffhanger, make sure you know what you're doing with it. Study other cliffhanger books and see how they did it. Yeah, that's my biggest advice there is just make sure you're doing it right. There is a right way to do a cliffhanger. There really is.
Well, it's really tricky. I don't think I would keep reading a series if book 1 was the cliffhanger. Lynn Curlin does the Nine Kingdoms series. The second book is a cliffhanger that made me want to throw the book at the wall.
Ooh.
It in no way was a conclusion whatsoever.
Yeah.
And there was I was so mad. But she had hooked me in book 1. I was all in it for book 2. When she cliffhangered me in book 2, I'm like, damn it all to hell. Give me the third book. This is stupid.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad you didn't throw it and never pick it back up again. That's excellent.
But I think you can get away with it if they're invested enough and into a series. I think
agree.
Pulling it off on the first book, a standalone, or the first in the series, I think you are really trying to break the mold there.
Yeah. Well, and I've seen it happen a few times where it takes some time. You burned if you did a cliffhanger like that, write way more books and prove yourself as a writer where you're not cliffhangering every book, where you're actually concluding arcs, where people can see your work so that those first reviews that come in that are like, screw you, I'm never reading you again, they might read something else and they go, okay, you're really good at this. I'll go back and look at it again. They might come around later on, but I think you're going to have to prove yourself as a writer. Don't do a first book as a cliffhanger. Make sure that you know how to conclude a book so that people don't think that this is your literal only work and you don't know how to finish things, because
And even a
readers don't like
cliffhanger's
that.
going to have some conclusions to it.
Yeah, I would hope so. That's the point of it. You know, like you want to finish something, and yes, you want them to keep reading, and you want them to be on the edge of their seat and being like, pre-order book 2, gimme, 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 gimme. You don't want them to be like, you're banished, I'm never looking at your work again, you giant jerk face. So there's a very fine line there. Be very careful when you tiptoe around it.
And it goes back to, like we were saying, with genre expectations.
Yes.
Some genres are going to be more open to that than others are.
Yes.
Some readers have very stringent expectations. And I think all readers have stringent expectations in certain areas, but not all genres have them in the same areas. So exactly how you conclude and what you're concluding, what is expected is going to depend on your genre.
I agree.
Another one that really gets me, one of my pet peeves, is when they throw in a twist at the end, but they've given no clues for it.
Oh, yeah. The twist has to be cupcaked. It has to be breadcrumbed.
Right?
Yes.
And so I was looking at, before the episode, I was looking on articles and Googling how, like, advice that people have for how to end a book well. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them had, like, there's 9 typical endings, most articles were saying. Cliffhanger was there, but it was, like, in the list of don't do, actually. And then a twist was in the ones to do, but it said you have to do it well. It's really tricky.
Yes.
And so I thought about that, because normally I'm like, just don't do it, because it's done poorly so often. But I can't say that, because then I want to be like, just don't do it unless you're Megan Whalen Turner. Then you can totally twist it all you want.
Explain that further.
Oh my God, she is amazing. Megan Whalen Turner is a fantasy author. The Thief is the book in like particular I'm talking about, but it's a whole series. It's so amazing. It's one of those books where I got to the end and I was like, what? No way! And then I sit and I think about it and I'm like, oh, like I can find all the cupcakes that I missed.
That's so cool.
It's not like she was being coy and hiding all of this stuff from me. It's not like she was trying to outsmart the reader. It was just a brilliantly crafted story. And I didn't feel cheated because the clues were there.
That's amazing.
I just missed them. And I think that's the trick, is if you think you're brilliant for giving this big twist at the end, but you didn't give any clues to the reader, you're going to make me mad.
Yeah.
If you give a great twist and there were tons of clues, I'm going to fall completely in love with you.
Absolutely. There's a writing term called red herring, which is basically you're throwing something out there to lead the reader somewhere where they are not correct at all. Like you've thrown it out there, it's like red herring, because it's like, oh my gosh, that's the obvious answer. And so you lead people away from the truth. And then when you bring them back in, you make sure that there are cupcakes surrounding your red herring so that people can kind of doubt and conclude and go, that doesn't quite make sense, but it does make sense. And this is totally has to be the answer. And then when you get to that end and it's like, that wasn't the answer, they go, what? And they want to go back and read it immediately so they can see what they missed. That is like writer goals right there. If somebody finishes your book and wants to go back and reread it immediately, yes.
I will say the Megan Whalen Turner series, the Thief series, I have read the first 3 in that series at least 5 times each.
That's amazing.
So then that's exactly what it does. I want to go in and just sit in there in the brilliance of it and read it over and over.
That's so fantastic.
Yeah. Super good.
Add that one to my read list. I haven't read that one.
Oh, I really like it. And I was thinking of other examples of stories that end fantastically well. Mm-hmm. And there were lots of lists online for that too. And now I have a really, really, which I always have, but now I have a stupidly long list of things I want to read. Why are there so many amazing books? When I start researching something and I see all these examples, I'm like, I have read nothing. I am
right?
There's so much to read.
We read constantly and you feel like you're never going to catch up. It's amazing.
But the ones that I had read that I was like, oh, those do land it really well. Shawshank Redemption.
Yes.
I really love.
Gosh.
Yeah, I love
That whole ending was like, oh my man.
And I like it because there was like a justice to it all. Like, there was no justice in the beginning, and then they got justice in the end. And I don't know, was it worth it because he lost his whole life stuck there? And that wasn't the point for him in the end, which was fantastic. And then Count of Monte Cristo is probably also one of my favorite books. Fantastic ending. And it's similar too, but a little bit more spiteful because he's got the revenge arc where his whole life was ruined and taken away. And so his whole purpose in life is revenge for that. And in the end, he learns more than the revenge,
Nice.
which is really cool because it's like,
That's very satisfying.
Yeah, and I think it's that character arc thing too, where they're like driven and tunnel vision on this one thing and they think only that one thing matters. And then at the end, the journey has taught them another layer and something else.
Yeah.
That's an arc. That's a satisfying arc to read.
That is a very satisfying arc.
The other one that was a really good ending that I noticed on the list, and I didn't think about it until I saw it on the list. I was like, oh, they're right. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
That's a good one too.
That's like,
I love the beginning and the end of that. The beginning and the end of that is just pure charm.
Yeah. And it's satisfying. I don't think it's entirely obvious and predictable like you thought it was going to go one way.
Right. Yeah.
And then Charlie was just better than what you thought the obvious ending was.
Yes.
And like the protagonist rised above my expectations.
Right.
Which was freaking
always
fantastic.
Refreshing. Yes. Yes. So and that is just constantly refreshing. And that was such an amazing, that is definitely a YA, coming of age, not even if it's not really coming of age, but a children's and YA book arc and genre expectations on
family.
That one. The important, yes, exactly. Yeah. What means the most. And oh my goodness, it was so good.
Yeah, those were really good.
Yeah, I like that one a lot.
I think the character arcs, like if I'm looking at them, man, the character arcs, I love. I love to be able to see from beginning to end a difference in the character.
Yeah. Trying to think of my favorite endings. I think The Usual Suspects for me is probably my favorite ending on.
I haven't read that one. What's the end?
Well, that's a movie. Go for the movie, the screenplay on that one, because of the beginning and the ending. It is the biggest twist.
That's Harrison Ford, right?
No. That's oh my gosh, what's his name? He was in American Beauty. Kevin Spacey. It's Kevin Spacey. Oh. It's unbelievably good. And that's one of those books where at the beginning, this is like part of our 1 and 2 part series. We're just talking about usual suspects, where it's a leap. So the ending is the beginning, and then you get the whole in between. So it's like, oh my gosh, this is what you're in for. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that happens a ton where it's like, here's where you are. Now here's the story of how we got to this point.
Exactly.
But they usually hold off on like the last, final moments.
That's exactly what this did. And this is like mind freaking blown. And I was putting pieces together and everything else. I was watching this. I don't even know if we were engaged yet. I was with my husband. This was like 20 years ago. And he was like, I was like, oh my gosh, this is what happens. And he was like, no. And he's like, oh, how did you know that? I'm like, of course, I didn't think at the time in cupcakes, but it was cupcakes. Like there were the moments there and putting everything together. And it was like, holy moly, this is amazing because it just so flawlessly worked together. It was such a well thought out piece. And honestly, if that's a book, I'm going to have to go read it like immediately because it is one of my absolute favorite movies.
So that's an interesting point though, because there were cupcakes, and even though you guessed it, if it was a book, look at the review we would write.
Right.
How satisfying it was for you to guess it and know it.
But I didn't know it till like almost, I put everything together as I was replaying that beginning scene again. I was like, oh my God, that happened. No way. No, I can't be right on that. That can't be right. And I was totally right. And I was like, yes, but not everybody is, because you don't always catch everything that's happening. And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. And that is so incredibly satisfying for certain fiction works. When you're reading it's, oh my gosh, keep reading. Like you get to those final chapters and you're just blowing through because you want to know what the heck happens. And that was most definitely one of those. Oof, incredible.
Nice.
Yeah, highly recommended.
Okay, so I've given like tons of horror examples and talk. So tell us about ending a romance novel.
Oh, ending a romance novel. Well, you have to conclude your arcs. Your main character has to have learned how to live with love, gotten over their own problems, gotten over the problems of the world, whatever. You conclude, and there is a happily ever after. I am sorry if you think that there cannot be. That is literally the genre expectation. You have to have a happily ever after. And that's what makes it a big R giant romance. So, yes. Happily ever after, run off in the sunset. You want to be thinking about how this couple lived just their end of their days in the best way possible. So,
I feel very naughty and mean right now because I know that this is like such a stickler point for Poppy. Like she's very passionate about that. So I'm so tempted to be like, you should go poke Poppy with every example of not happily ever after.
It's not a romance. Nope, it's not a romance. That is, sure, you can do it. And there are people who pop in and say, oh, I'm going to make a tragic end to I'm like, well, it's no longer romance, it's tragedy.
Well, what about the cancer ones?
That's not romance. I mean, it can be romantic, but it's fiction at that point, or it is coming of age. There's multiple genres at that point. But if there is not a happy ending, it is not purely in a romance category. You cannot sell it as a romance.
What if the guy has become a better person, has learned a lot, and the girl dies?
Doesn't matter. It is not. It can be romantic. It can be a romantic fiction. Don't get me wrong. It can have romance in it. A lot of books have romance in it. But if you kill off one of your mains, it is no longer in the romance category. You cannot position it as a romance. You just can't. It is literally the genre expectation. It is part of it. It is the ending has to be happily ever after or happy for now. It can't be and they're dead, the end. That just doesn't work out. It doesn't matter how sweet the entire journey was. Nope. It is no longer a purely romance.
So there are romance novels that end with someone dying. And if you have written one of these, do not ask Poppy to pick it for you.
I will die on that hill. Nope. It is not a romance. You have a fiction with romantic qualities to it. There you go. It can be in another genre, but it's not a romance genre. Sorry.
That's totally fine. That's totally fine. I am not writing a romance where someone dies, so I just think it's cute how...
I have, and honestly, I've blocked this author from my mind, so I couldn't even tell you who wrote it. But I got to a point where there was a book that I read, and I was like, this book is great. I love this book. It's fantastic. I'm reading it. It's well written. It's great. It's crafted. It's fabulous. And I got to the end. The end was beautiful. And the epilogue is 10 years later, and the woman died of cancer. And I'm like, screw you, banished, never again. And I'm like, why are the reviews so low on this? I don't understand. As I'm reading, they're like, it had like a 3.1 or something like that. And I'm like, this doesn't make sense. It's a really good book. And I'm like reading through it. It's really incredible. Epilogue, killed it. Absolutely murdered your entire book because somebody died. You can't do that in romance. You will get absolutely skewered.
Speaking of which, epilogues on the list that I was reading about, that's like a mistake too and a taboo is people who make their ending an epilogue. So there's the final battle. Okay, and then afterwards, instead of having like a chapter concluding all of the arcs, they just have an epilogue. And your epilogue is not your ending. That's different.
You need a cool down after the workout, not the body 1 year later.
Yeah. I mean, I wish it worked that way. I'd rather just turn the page and my body's there after a year of workout.
No, I want to know what happened. I want to know how that character changed, not a year later, immediately. I want to know that immediate change. And you can't see that when you're stuck in the middle of a climax.
And if you aren't doing a year later, if you're like, oh, it's the next day, it's not an epilogue. It's your last
It's
chapter.
not.
So that was one of the
agree with
things
that.
I saw. They were like, don't confuse those two, which made sense to me. I don't know that I have a strong opinion on epilogues in general, one way or the other, or prologues.
It depends.
I don't think they bother me one way or the other.
I like them in romance. I really like an epilogue in romance because I want to see them later on. And I don't feel with romance there's a huge I don't call it an issue because it's not, but it's a fantasy, right? So people are falling in love after a week. People are falling in love after a couple days. I want to see that it is the long haul. And so I think the romance epilogue is kind of important because you don't want it to be like they're burning so bright because they're just feeling the lust, right? So you want to see that they actually did make it and that now they're a family, or now they're married, or now they're traveling the world together and this is what their life is because of the week or two that they fell in love from the entire book.
That makes sense. I can't think of in other genres why I would need a prologue or an epilogue, but I'm not against them. I've read good ones.
I'm against a prologue, but
You're against the prologue.
I am against a prologue. I get bored. I'm like, oh, just get me into the action already. I don't care about all your people and bequeath to who. And I'm not good at prologues. I will totally skip them just about every single time. Especially if you can't capture me in like the first like 3 lines of a prologue, I'm peacing out. I'm just going to start your book now. That's all.
So speaking of first 3 lines, we talked about the importance of a first line. Do you think the very last line of the novel is super important?
Yes. Gosh, yes. You need to spend just as much time
I don't know if I put enough
baby.
time into that.
It's always difficult. And I couldn't even tell you how I've made my last lines or what they meant to me. I tried to just make something witty that it's like, okay, this is the last thing these people are going to say to each other on the page. This is the last capture of the world that I want this person to have. What do you do with that? And so That's is important to think about, this is going to be the lasting impression that you have. Make it good. Pay attention to it. And I don't think I've ever written a first or a last line on the first pass. I just haven't.
One thing I saw that really hit with me, it talked about the last line. A lot of times the really poignant ones will deal with the theme.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of like the last line, the really, really epic good ones that are studied are the ones that's like, that's the whole book right there. That's the message of the whole book right there in that last line.
That is really cool.
Damn impressive.
It is.
I need to go look at what my last lines are.
I know, right? It's like, oh, mental notes. I need to go and just check all of them and make sure everybody's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
To hit that theme and to hit the whole thing. Oof.
And knowing your theme too, but that's an editing thing too, which is something else too. So editing, that was something. Okay, so when you're starting out, I know I keep talking about all these lists, but I found all these lists with information that I was like, I don't know how I feel about this stuff, so I'm just gonna keep bringing it up. It talked about how knowing where you're going, knowing exactly what happens in the ending, they recommend that you should do that when starting. I never do that. Ever, ever, ever.
Yeah, I think that's a Plancer thing. I think that's kind of the excitement of a Plancer when you guys just start writing, that you don't know what the heck is going to happen and here's the journey. And I think there's some kind of energy to that is really exciting and neat. But how do you combat it? How do you figure out what your ending is going to be?
I don't know until I'm there. And half the times when I'm throwing out cupcakes in the first draft, I'm doing them completely off of a gut feeling. And then 75% of the cupcakes I generally use. I'm like, oh, that's why that's there. And I pull it in. But then when I go through my first draft and editing, I have to comb out the cupcakes that ended up not being used and were just, Cass was in a weird random mood. And for some reason, it's really important to know that she has pink underwear on and it never comes up again later. And I'm like, I don't care about your pink underwear. I need to take this out. But I'm taking out those cupcakes and I'm also sculpting because now I know what my ending is. And now I know what I'm building towards. So crafting it to fit the ending better is like my main goal in my first draft of edits.
Oh, that's good to know. I've changed over the years because I pantsed at first. Because when I just started writing, you start writing, you just write. That's all there is to it. You just go. You're like, I don't know. I'm just going to start writing something.
Which
and
is a win.
Do.
Right? As long as you're writing, you're winning.
Absolutely. And so you're just, barfing out this first draft of the first thing you've ever written before, and it's just exciting and awesome and fantastic, and you're just like, I think it's done. I don't know, is it done? Well, okay, I guess it feels like kind of maybe it's done. I don't know. And then you go through it again and you're like, oh, wait, except for this happened in my first chapter and all these things, and you have to really consider what you're doing. And now I've gotten to the point where I'm starting to plot and I'm starting to figure out, and my endings are coming sometimes, which I never thought would happen, are coming now sometimes first before anything else. And then I'm like, oh, that's how it ends. Okay, well, let's build up everything in between. And how did it start? Let's go backwards and see. And that's a weird one for me. But my brain's also kind of chaos, and it likes to do things the complete opposite of how it did the time
probably,
before.
Like one of the most chaos people I've ever known.
I am, yeah.
And I love that about you.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you. It is a strength and also a weakness. I can adapt like nobody else, but at the same time, sometimes keeping a clear focus is just hysterical. And trying to teach people how to do something, I'm like, measurements, time, let's do it this way this time.
As someone's productive, chaos is fine.
Yeah.
And
I just like different routes to go to A to B.
Yeah,
I like
highly
to take
productive.
A
you're
to
one
F
of the
and
most
backwards.
chaotic people I've ever known, but you're also one of the most productive people I've ever known.
Oh, well, that's good.
So
Yay.
That's like a super win.
Hooray. But yeah, so I do stuff differently every single time, but I've found that my drafts that went the fastest and had the easiest endings, I already knew what was happening. Otherwise, I have to pause sometimes, and like the last 3 to 5 chapters, I'm like, oh, what's happening here?
Oh,
and then
yeah, I have to do that all the time.
It's like a big pause. It's like I got to sit back. And sometimes I have to sit back in those last 3 to 5 chapters. I have to reread the whole thing again because I just can't get it. I really get stuck on those last ones. So, because you just need to end it and you need to conclude everything, and you have so many things. And if you've blown through a draft like I do, then you might have forgotten some of the things because you were just tearing through some certain chapters. And it's like, I
don't go back and read my first draft until I've done it all. Like, I'll rarely go back and I might read the first couple paragraphs for the chapter I'm in. But if those last chapters and that last, if like there's a big climax and I'm trying to figure out how to pull it in and what to do, I go to my collection of encyclopedias. So I'll usually have specific encyclopedias for that world and that story
that you've built up already. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I go, and I don't go in there, like, I will just start randomly reading. Sometimes I just start randomly flipping through pages, and sometimes I'll take a couple days where I'm just reading random information and facts about a particular topic relevant to the world.
That makes sense.
And I'll be like, I know there's something that concludes it with this particular lore or with this particular belief or specialty. I just don't know what it is. So then I just immerse myself in research to learn more about that until I find it. And then a lot of times I have to add in tons of scenes too when I go back. Yeah. Once I've written my first draft ending, I'm like, oh, I'm going to have to explain this and this so much more. So I'll generally have a couple big scenes I have to go back in and add in. So that's normal for me too.
That's totally normal. I've added chapters before, just full ones, being like, oh, I needed something here. I get that completely when you're going back and editing everything. Usually mine is like to go fact check something, and then I end up reading the whole thing again. Oops, don't do that, whole bunch of people. That is a bad poppy habit.
I don't have that habit.
Oh, man.
I don't know. I don't go through and reread my stuff a ton unless I'm like, okay, now's the editing phase. Now we go through and reread it.
I'm doing that right now, and I've had exterior things that have stopped me from the draft that I'm doing right now. And I've gone back to fact check something, and I've reread it like 2 times. I'm only in chapter like 12, and I reread the whole thing at least twice. And I'm like, whoops, I need to stop, and I just need to keep going.
That's a good sign, though, that you like it. It is a good sign.
As
long as you're not like changing it and getting obsessed with getting it perfect.
No, I mean, I'll find a couple grammatical things where I'm like, okay, I needed a comma there, but that's just me, and that's what I do anyway. So
it might be too your brain figuring out the story.
It is, because this one's really way deeper than I anticipated it being. So I think it just depends on, some drafts just come out sometimes differently every time. And those people who just know what they're doing every single time baffle me. But I'm just not that person no matter what I do. I mow the lawn differently every time I mow. So I'm that person. So whatever.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Let's go backwards this time. Let's do the front first. It's just me. Oh boy. So
That doesn't surprise me at all. Not even a little bit.
I'm glad.
I think, too, though, if you get to the end, I think the decisions you should be making for your ending should always trump things that you've done prior. So if there's like something really epic or cool you can do in the ending or some big idea that you have, always put it and do it. Don't be like, oh, I don't want to do that because it'll mess up what I did in the beginning. You can go back and edit the beginning. Always go big and cool on your ending if you have the idea there.
Yeah.
But definitely say that.
Yes. Getting it all out there, first round, and then going through and doing it again. I've completely rewritten ending chapters. I mean, I have one that is an ending of the series, but it's only 2 books. And you know which one I'm talking about. And it's that ending I've rewritten, I don't know, 3 or 4 times completely. And that's scrapped and rewritten.
That's something we can actually, because the first book is out if anyone wants to get it.
Yeah.
So that's My Song's Curse. But My Song's Gift, you have an editing with your editor right now.
Yes.
Yep.
That baby's not coming out for multiple years, but that ending, oh man, I got stuck on that ending for absolute months. And then I would go through the whole thing again in edits, and I would get stuck on that ending freaking again, and I'd have to rewrite it because I'm just like, it's just not hitting. It's just not concluding because it's such a complex book and it's such a complex storyline that I just needed more time to figure out what I was doing because I was still new. I wasn't ready to end that book, and I had to learn a whole bunch before I did. And I still don't know if it's entirely right. But my editor will tell me if it is or not. So that's good news because I don't know. I don't know at this point because I've gotten it to where the best of my abilities that I could possibly do, and that it's in another person's hands so that I'm away from it and that they can tell me if it hits or not. So we'll see.
That brings up an interesting point too, though, because you were saying, I just don't know. You're just like, you get so burned out by the end, right? After doing it so many times. I think you get burned out even the first draft and you get to the end because you get excited and you want to end it. You want it to end. And I feel like endings get the least amount of attention because you're always so burned out when you get to them.
I agree with that completely.
I would definitely recommend on some of your editing rounds and having some passes that are just going over the ending, not going through the rest of it chapters. First.
Yes.
Because you're so burned out. You are.
Well, and you get to it, especially when you get excited about querying and you get excited about your edits are so close to being done and you're like, oh, I can almost query. Oh my gosh, guys, I can almost query. And then it's like you just want to speed through the rest and be done with it. And you can't do that on your endings. It's so important to nail them. So I think that is fabulous advice, is to just try to hit your ending first, or not even first, but just off of the set that you've done for your editing. Go through it once and then go through it again a couple weeks later, just your last 3 to 5 chapters.
I like to give a couple months in between
a
draft and a new round of editing. So I'll usually switch gears and switch projects. I'll finish a first draft and then I'll go do something else. Mm-hmm. And when I do a full round of editing, then I'll set it aside and go work on something else. I need it to breathe for a couple months because then I can come back and I can read what I wrote instead of what I was thinking was it there.
Yes.
Because it's so much you're reading what is in your head versus what's actually on the page.
Yes.
And that break gives that to me. What I do basically all the time is when I come back after a couple months and do a round of editing, I'll schedule one that's just editing the ending. It's not going beginning to end. So I'll have taken a couple months break from it. And I don't start
that idea
at the beginning because I know the story.
That's so smart. And what's fun about it is that once you finish, you can start the book again, and it is almost like it's new again.
Fresh in my mind, because then I'm like, I know what I need to have in the beginning because I know what happens in the end. And I think that's kind of why we wanted to do this as a 2-parter, is because your first chapter and your last chapter, they are linked together.
Yes.
They really should mirror each other in some way. They should reference each other in some way. They should they're like a little duo. And so you
this is how it started. And you went through this entire journey. And this is the differences between when you started and when you ended. And you need to have those blatantly clear so that your reader has this satisfied feeling of like, oh gosh, this is where they started. We went through this huge journey together and look how different they are. Look how different the world is. Look what happened between then and here to show all these amazing differences. So yeah, I think that's definitely smart. It is a mirror because you need to be able to see the differences between them and how contrasting they are now.
We talked about the last line being like this is what the book is about, or like a theme thing. Mm-hmm. I think that last line should definitely hit notes that were hit in your first chapter. There should be a good first chapter should have hints of what's to come in the last chapter.
Ooh, I like that. I gotta go back and check my stuff again.
And of course, everything's different genre-wise, and I obviously I fantasy and horror are what I'm going to go to. But I want that hint of what the main theme and conflict is, and that main conflict should be dealing with your theme as well. So when it concludes in the last chapter, there's no way it hasn't somehow tied to or mirrored with when it was introduced, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully. It's tricky. I like the idea, too, of, like, that last line, if you mirror lines, like the first line and last line, or maybe the last line of your first chapter and the last line of your last chapter, looking at comparing those two lines to each other for tone and what they're saying and the message. And it will show a lot of the emotional arc you've taken the reader on for the book, right?
Yes. Hopefully. Gosh, hopefully.
I don't know. We're all trying. I need to go read my stuff now and see if I do this at all.
Uh-oh. Like, I need to go make sure. Oh, my goodness. It's so true. All right.
Yeah.
I like that.
So what else do we want to talk about with endings? What else do you have, Poppy dear?
The only other thing I have is some of the cliche things that readers don't typically like, which is being misled to the last chapter, where the entire book was all of a sudden a dream, or...
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's like the same cliche as don't start it with your character looking in a mirror. Don't end it with it all being a dream.
Gosh, don't end it with all being a dream, because then it feels like, well, why did I read it? You know, it ends up... Really?
You
like,
wasted
what was the
my
point
time
of that?
And everyone's. Thanks a lot, jerk face.
That is not satisfying. So the characters are so real as you're reading something. If the author's done their job, they're in it and they are invested into what these people, because to your reader's mind, they're real. And so when you've made up everything and it's all fake, or they're in a game, or they're in a dream, it's like, wait, what? Like, I was really invested in these people. They were real to me, and that you broke contracts. You just took those people and made them fake, and it's disheartening, I think, for readers.
I can handle like a game if it's revealed halfway through, and then it's like them trying to escape, like a Matrix scenario. That's their reality, as long as it's not revealed as a way to conclude. So like Lost, the TV series, they concluded it by basically a dream, which is the same. It's the same cop-out to me when you're dead and you're stuck in between worlds and you didn't know you were dead, right?
Yep.
It's the same thing as a dream, where you're saying none of it's real, none of it mattered.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to make sense. There's no logic. And then I'm like, well, then you've broken all the believability rules within this world. So now I just feel like I've wasted my time.
It's like this hand-wavium. I couldn't think of anything better, so I made everybody made up.
Yeah.
Hand-wavium. It's a dream. Right? It's between worlds, right? So now all the logic makes sense. No, it doesn't, because it's all made up and fake. That's not cool.
Now you just made everyone mad.
Which is kind of hilarious, because my husband asked the other day if we wanted to restart Lost, and I said, not a chance in hell. Nope, they lost me. It's not real anymore. All those awesome emotions in that first season, nope. It was all fake, made up. Anyway, that's me just being pouty about it. I needed a happily ever after, and I didn't get one, and it made me sad.
I almost wonder, too, maybe I'm just being a judgy brat, but I always feel like whenever they do that, it's because they didn't know the ending, and they'd already... It's like if you were writing a series and your first book got published and there's some things in there that you just can't explain by book 4. So you hand waving it because you're like, I don't know. I published that one before I had an answer and I can't find an answer.
Right.
Yeah, that's what it feels like.
And wavium. It was all a dream.
So don't do that.
Like sheep in the last chapter going through and like weird colored balloons floating everywhere. And everyone's like, what are they doing? It was a dream. I just made that up because I couldn't think of anything better. But I wanted you to know that now it's a dream.
Well, sheep will tell you that for sure.
Yes. Sigh. No good. Yes. That's all I have.
All right. So basically write a really good last chapter, write a really good first chapter, write really good chapters all in between, have awesome characters, have awesome plot. I mean, just
conclude those awesome plot
do awesome
and all the
with
arcs.
Everything. No problem.
Yes. What do we know? Oh, you know what we might not have mentioned that we probably should have is concluding the arcs of your side characters as well, if they had arcs going on.
That's satisfying.
Everything should be concluded. If you have a book that's a standalone or a series end, conclude everything or don't have it in there.
Or further it along if it's a series. Acknowledge it.
Exactly. Get ready for book 2.
I agree with that.
Introduce certain things. You can totally introduce stuff if you're continuing the series, but don't introduce stuff in the last few chapters if it's a standalone and you're all done.
My mind is wandering. I have 2 options here for a challenge, and I want to ask you which one you want.
Ooh. Okay.
Okay. So the obvious challenge that we can give for this episode is give us the last line of the current work in progress you're working on, right?
Sure.
Something a little unique is what is the last dialogue line from your protagonist?
Ooh, that's a good one too.
It's the last words they say out loud.
I like that.
Which one do you want?
I don't know. And telling me, did one spin you better than the other?
Well, how about
What's
this?
When you say stuff out
they
loud,
can
you're
do
like,
whichever
no, what's she
one
gonna
they
say?
want. They can do whichever one they want. They can
Okay, I like that.
Yeah,
I like it.
pick. If you do give the last
Choose
line,
your own adventure. Kind of.
if you do give the last line for your work in progress, I would love it if you also tagged the post where you gave your first line, because I would love to see them matched up together. That'd be cool.
That would be cool.
I'd be down. All right.
Okay.
Well, until then, keep writing, keep punching those keys. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. And if you liked this episode, please subscribe and give us that clickable 5-star love.
Got writer questions or feedback? Reach out through our website. And until next time, make sure to punch the keys.